The ranch sat at the edge of the horizon, a stubborn outpost of civilization clinging to the wide, open plains. Dust swirled lazily across the land, carried by a wind that seemed to know no master. Here, nature ruled with a quiet, unyielding authority, and anyone who attempted to tame it quickly learned the price of overconfidence. The lone rancher had built her life around this harsh environment, not out of stubbornness alone, but because the land demanded resilience, patience, and a deep understanding of its rhythms. Her house, a sturdy structure of weathered wood and stone, looked as though it had grown from the ground itself. Windows glimmered in the late afternoon sun, reflecting the endless stretch of plains and hills beyond. Smoke from the kitchen chimney drifted lazily into the sky, the faint scent of burning cedar mingling with the tang of livestock. Every board, every nail, and every stone in the homestead bore the imprint of her labor and determination. She had arrived at this place years ago, following a winding road that seemed to vanish behind rolling hills, and had refused to leave even when the solitude pressed against her like an invisible weight. Despite the serenity, there was an undercurrent of tension that came with isolation. The rancher had few neighbors, and the ones who lived within miles of her property were often as wary of human contact as she was of theirs. The world she inhabited was one where self-reliance wasn't a virtue, it was survival. The cattle needed feeding, the fences required constant repair, and the seasons demanded vigilance. Each morning began before sunrise, with the crisp air carrying the sounds of rustling grasses and distant bird calls. The rancher moved through her chores with a practiced efficiency, her hands skilled in both gentle care and hard labor. She knew which calves needed extra attention, which gates were on the verge of collapse, and which parts of the property would flood after heavy rain. But the isolation wasn't merely practical. It had become a part of her identity. She preferred the company of her animals to that of strangers, the quiet of the open land to the chatter of townsfolk. Solitude allowed her to think, to plan, to anticipate. It was both a shield and a weapon. Outsiders often assumed that a lone woman on a ranch so far from help was vulnerable, but they underestimated the sharp intelligence and unshakable resolve that had carried her through storms, both literal and figurative. Every day she tested herself against the land, and every day she proved she could endure. Her life was regimented but never dull. There were the ordinary trials of ranch life, the unpredictability of the weather, the occasional wayward animal, and the constant maintenance of her homestead. And then there were the moments when the land itself seemed almost alive, speaking in the language of wind and sky. She had learned to read those signs. The shift in the clouds before a storm, the subtle changes in the soil that indicated water beneath the surface, the distant echo of hooves signaling a herd moving across the hills. These were not mystical insights, but hard-earned knowledge, the kind that separated someone who survived from someone who faltered. Yet, for all her strength, there were elements of vulnerability. The remoteness that protected her also meant she could not call for help easily. A serious injury, a violent intruder, or a natural disaster could become life-threatening in moments. That knowledge was always present, a quiet hum beneath her daily routine, shaping her decisions and sharpening her instincts. She kept tools within reach, weapons locked and loaded, and pathways cleared for quick movement. Every object on the ranch had a purpose, and every decision was measured against the unforgiving reality of her surroundings. It was a life that demanded attention and respect, and one she embraced fully. The isolation had forged her into someone others might call stubborn, others might call fearless, but she simply called it necessary. In this place there was no room for hesitation or doubt. Each day she met the world on her own terms, and each evening she reflected on her victories and failures under the vast canopy of stars. The ranch was more than a home. It was a crucible that had shaped her identity, a place where her strength, intellect, and resilience were tested daily. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting the land in hues of amber and gold, The rancher paused at the edge of the pasture, surveying her domain. The cattle grazed quietly. The wind carried a promise of coming change, and the solitude enveloped her like a familiar cloak. She had survived storms, harsh winters, and the occasional wandering threat. She had done it alone, and she would continue to do so. The land had made her who she was, and in return, she had claimed it. Not as a conqueror, but as a guardian, vigilant and unyielding. The sudden clatter of tires on the gravel driveway was jarring, a sharp intrusion into the rhythmic quiet of the ranch. The rancher had learned to read the subtle shifts in sound across her property, the low whistle of the wind through the grass, the distant cry of a hawk, the soft shuffle of hooves on dry earth. But this was unmistakable, a vehicle approaching, deliberate and persistent. She paused in her work, wiping sweat from her brow, squinting toward the dust trail curling along the horizon. Visitors were rare, strangers even rarer. And yet, in a few minutes, the old family truck, worn and rattling, came into view, carrying faces she had hoped not to see for a long while. Her in-laws arrived under the pretense of a cordial visit, though she knew the truth often lurked behind polite gestures. The woman driving, her mother-in-law, had the same calculating eyes she remembered from the first time they met, eyes that seemed to measure and weigh everything, especially the lives of others. The man beside her, her father-in-law, radiated an air of patronizing superiority, as if the land itself were an inconvenience to him rather than a living, breathing entity to be respected. The rancher's gut twisted, a cold premonition stirring in her chest, but she remained outwardly composed. Hospitality in these moments was a mask she had perfected over years of cautious encounters. The greetings were formal, curt, and laced with subtle barbs. The in-laws commented on the ranch with thinly veiled skepticism, remarking on the challenges of living so far from town, the hardships of raising cattle alone. Every word felt like a test, a probing into weaknesses they assumed she had. The rancher, though accustomed to isolation, was no stranger to such scrutiny. She met their remarks with calm acknowledgement, nods that were polite but non-committal, smiles that concealed a simmering defiance. Inside, she catalogued every gesture, every shift in their posture, every glance. She was always observing, always calculating. Yet there was something more troubling beneath the surface, a sense that this visit was not merely social. The in-laws moved through her home with a familiarity that was both invasive and precise, as if mapping the space for some unspoken purpose. They commented on her belongings, on her routines, even on the layout of the kitchen. Each observation carried a subtle condescension, a reminder that they considered themselves the arbiters of propriety, taste, and normalcy. In the silence between their words, the rancher sensed an encroaching threat, though its shape remained elusive. Dinner was a quiet affair, punctuated by measured conversation and veiled criticism. The rancher served her guests with the efficiency and grace she had honed over years of self-reliance, but the air was thick with tension. The in-laws spoke of town gossip, of distant relatives, of imagined slights, all while their eyes lingered on her possessions and her movements, weighing and judging. She remained calm, responding only when necessary. But each exchange felt like a carefully choreographed battle, one she had to navigate with precision. As the evening wore on, the tension escalated in subtle ways. The in-laws' smiles grew sharper, their laughter hollow, their casual touches calculated. They began to insinuate themselves into her space, questioning her methods, her decisions, and even her autonomy. It was a psychological probing, a test of boundaries, and she recognized it immediately. She could sense the storm gathering, not in the sky above, but in the intentions of those sitting in her home. By the time night settled over the ranch, the dust from the day had clung to her clothes and skin, mingling with the faint scent of smoke from the hearth. She felt a restless energy, a flicker of apprehension that she could not shake. The isolation she had once cherished now felt precarious, the sanctuary she had built suddenly vulnerable to intrusion. Her mind raced, considering contingencies, escape routes, and ways to assert control without escalating the situation too soon. She knew instinctively that the evening would not end with polite farewells. The in-laws, sensing or perhaps seeking her unease, leaned closer, their conversation shifting toward personal matters. Questions about her habits, her finances, her relationships with neighbors, all intended to unsettle, to probe, to expose. The rancher maintained her composure, but the unease coiled tighter in her chest, a warning bell echoing in the quiet spaces of her home. She realized, with a sharp clarity, that she was not just hosting relatives. She was under scrutiny, under assessment, and possibly under threat. By the time the visit reached its apex, the in-laws had revealed their true colors: polite pretense, masking something more aggressive, more invasive. Their intentions, subtle at first, had become unmistakable, like shadows stretching across the walls in the dim light of the hearth. The rancher, trained by years of hardship and solitude, felt the first spark of defiance flare within her. She would not be an easy target. She would not surrender her autonomy, her dignity, or her control, not without a fight. And as the night deepened, the air heavy with unspoken menace, she made a silent promise to herself. Whatever unfolded, she would face it on her terms. The night had grown heavy, thick with the smell of wood smoke and tension, when the true purpose of the visit finally revealed itself. The rancher had been alert all evening, her instincts honed by years of solitude and self-reliance. But nothing could have prepared her for the violation that was about to occur, a calculated, cruel assertion of control by the people she had once considered family. It began with a subtle maneuver, almost imperceptible at first. The in-laws offered to help with a chore, suggesting she step aside so they could organize the supplies in her barn. The rancher sensed the trap immediately. Their tone, overly insistent yet oddly detached, carried a weight that hinted at something darker. She had learned to read such gestures, the sudden insistence, the false concern. But before she could react, they moved with alarming coordination, closing the space around her like predators circling prey. Her protests, initially calm and measured, were met with laughter that felt hollow and sharp. They claimed it was a joke, a test of her spirit or humor, but the rancher knew better. She had faced storms, wild animals, and isolation that could crush even the strongest of wills, yet the vulnerability she felt now was unlike any she had known. This was human cruelty, deliberate and intimate, targeting not her livelihood but her very sense of self. In moments, the scene escalated. They forced her to disrobe, stripping away not only her clothing, but the protective armor of autonomy she had built around herself. The rancher's shock surged into a wave of anger and disbelief. Her body remained poised, a mixture of frozen tension and readiness, while her mind raced through possibilities, escape routes, defensive maneuvers, and ways to reclaim control. She understood that hesitation could cost her everything, yet the violation had left her momentarily unbalanced, a rare crack in her otherwise impenetrable resolve. The in-laws, oblivious to her inner storm, continued their display of dominance, speaking in tones of mockery and condescension. Every word they uttered was meant to diminish her, to remind her that, in their eyes, she was vulnerable and subordinate. But even in that moment of humiliation, a spark of defiance ignited within the rancher. She had endured isolation, storms, injury, and the relentless challenges of survival in the wild. No one would reduce her to an object of ridicule without consequence. Her eyes narrowed, scanning the room, mapping possibilities. The barn door was a few steps away. The fireplace tools hung within reach, and the shadows cast by the flickering lamplight offered potential concealment. She measured every breath, every movement, conserving energy while preparing for action. Anger surged through her veins, sharp and clear, replacing the initial shock with clarity. This was the moment when instinct, honed by years of living in the wild, would dictate her next move. With sudden precision, she struck, not recklessly, but decisively. The rancher grabbed a heavy object within reach, forcing a momentary retreat. The in-laws, caught off guard by the ferocity and speed of her response, stumbled. Their laughter faltered, replaced by the flicker of genuine uncertainty. She seized the shift in power, using her knowledge of the space and the terrain to assert control. Every movement was calculated, a blend of strategy and raw emotion, a reclamation of the autonomy they had attempted to strip away. "You're coming with me," she said, her voice low and unwavering, carrying the weight of authority that had been hers all along. It was not a plea, not a warning. It was a declaration of reclaimed power. She would not allow them to leave this space unchallenged. They would face the consequences of their actions, whether through justice, survival, or a reckoning only she could deliver. The in-laws, realizing the seriousness of her intent, attempted resistance, but the rancher's endurance and skill gave her an advantage. Each step, each maneuver, was informed by years of navigating isolation and danger. She guided them, firm, unyielding, unafraid, toward the barn, the threshold of the wild that had both protected her and honed her instincts. The reversal was complete. The predators had become the prey, the control she had lost temporarily now fully restored. Even as the initial shock faded, the emotional resonance lingered. The betrayal was not merely physical, it was an assault on her identity, her autonomy, and her sense of safety. Yet in the aftermath, she understood something profound. Her power had never truly left her. It had been tested, threatened, and temporarily challenged, but her strength, rooted in survival, self-reliance, and unwavering determination, remained unbroken. As the in-laws stumbled behind her, guided by a combination of fear and compliance, the rancher felt a surge of clarity and purpose. The night air outside the barn was cool, crisp, and liberating. Each step across the threshold was a step away from violation and toward justice, or at the very least, toward reclaiming what they had attempted to take from her. The night outside was cold and sharp, each gust of wind slicing across the open plains like a living thing. The stars hung high and distant, indifferent to the human conflicts unfolding below. The rancher led her in-laws across the uneven ground, her bare feet pressing into the rough earth, every step measured, deliberate. The shock of the evening still pulsed through her, a rhythmic hammer of adrenaline and anger. But now, beneath the initial sting of humiliation, something else had begun to burn. A spark of defiance, a clarity of purpose that refused to be dimmed. She felt the weight of the in-laws' presence behind her, a constant reminder of the violation they had inflicted. Their attempts to assert control had failed, yet they continued to struggle, their movements erratic, their tone increasingly frantic. For the first time, they realized that the woman they had underestimated was neither powerless nor passive. Her gaze, cold and unwavering, met theirs in brief glances, silently communicating that the balance of power had shifted. Every step across the terrain reinforced her sense of command. She moved with the intimate knowledge of the land that years of solitude had given her. She knew the soil, the hidden roots, the small dips in the ground where one could stumble. Every detail became a weapon, every shadow a potential ally. Her body, honed by labor and survival, carried strength and precision that her in-laws could not match. They had underestimated her physical and mental endurance, and now they were paying for it. Her mind raced, even as her body acted. She considered every possible outcome, mapping escape routes, potential barriers, and tools within reach. The ranch was a fortress in her mind, every structure and feature a part of her strategy. The barn loomed ahead, a solid dark silhouette against the faint glow of the horizon, offering both shelter and leverage. She knew that inside, she could control the environment even more fully, her advantage amplified by familiarity with every corner, every nook, every shadow. But this moment was more than tactical. It was profoundly personal. The spark of defiance was not simply a matter of survival, it was an assertion of identity. The rancher had built her life on self-reliance, endurance, and respect for her own autonomy. The in-laws' actions had attempted to strip all of that away. And now, with their resistance faltering, she understood that her response would define the terms of this night, and perhaps the rest of her life. She would not allow them to diminish her, nor would she let fear dictate her actions. As they neared the barn, her breathing slowed, controlled but deliberate. Each step was measured, a rhythmic counterpoint to the chaotic energy behind her. She could hear the in-laws muttering, their voices trembling between frustration, fear, and disbelief. Their attempts to regain composure were weak, their authority shattered. The rancher felt a surge of empowerment, a validation of the years she had spent surviving in isolation. She was more than capable, more than resilient, and this moment crystallized that truth. In the dim glow of lantern light spilling from the barn's open door, she paused briefly. Her mind raced with contingency plans, what she would do if they tried to flee, how she could assert further control, and how she might use their fear to her advantage. But even in the midst of tactical calculation, the spark of defiance burned brighter than strategy. It was raw, fierce, and unyielding. She had been violated, yes, but she was not defeated. Not now, not ever. "You're not leaving," she said firmly, her voice low but carrying the weight of command. "Not until this is settled." The words were simple, but the authority behind them was undeniable. They had assumed they could overpower her through intimidation and humiliation, but they had miscalculated. They had never truly understood the person they confronted, the rancher whose life had been forged in hardship, solitude, and relentless perseverance. The in-laws exchanged nervous glances, their bravado faltering under the steady intensity of her gaze. For the first time that night, they were no longer in control. They were reacting, uncertain, aware that their power had evaporated. The spark of defiance in her chest now threatened to become a blaze, fueled by the recognition of her own strength and the undeniable injustice of the evening's events. As the rancher guided them into the barn, the night air behind them carrying the scent of earth and distant rain, she felt the tension in her body begin to shift. No longer merely reacting, she was poised, ready to dictate the next phase of events. The spark of defiance had transformed into determination, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would emerge not just unbroken, but dominant. The evening had tested her, humiliated her, and pushed her to the edge. But now, the edge was hers to command. Inside the barn, the air smelled of hay, leather, and faint traces of livestock, a mixture that was both grounding and familiar. The Laham rancher paused at the threshold, letting her eyes sweep across the space. The dim light from a single lantern cast long, jagged shadows along the walls, making the barn seem larger and more imposing than it actually was. This was her domain, the place where she held absolute advantage, a fact that had not been true moments before, but was now undeniable. For the first time since the confrontation began, she allowed herself to fully feel the anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. It was a precise, measured anger, not blind rage. Every slight, every violation, every mocking glance from her in-laws fueled a controlled intensity. The initial shock had faded, replaced by clarity. They had underestimated her, and now it was time to reclaim what had been taken. She would not simply survive this night. She would assert control, decisively and irrevocably. Her hands moved almost automatically, scanning the barn for tools that could serve as leverage. A heavy pitchfork leaned against a stall, a coil of rope hung from a hook near the rafters, and a shovel rested in the corner, its blade worn but solid. These were simple implements, ordinary in the hands of someone untrained, but in hers, they were instruments of authority. She selected the rope first, looping it carefully, methodically, so that she could restrain them if necessary. Her actions were deliberate, precise, every movement a reaffirmation of competence and control. "You made a mistake," she said, her voice low and unwavering. The words were directed at the in-laws, but they were also a declaration to herself. A line had been crossed, and the moment for hesitation had ended. She would not wait for them to strike again. She would act on her terms. They flinched at the tone, sensing the shift from defensive posture to assertive command. The power had shifted fully, and it was now hers to wield. Her mind raced through the potential outcomes with military precision. Could they overpower her? Unlikely. They were exhausted, disoriented, and emotionally unsteady. Could they escape? Perhaps. But the barn's layout, combined with her intimate knowledge of the surrounding land, gave her a clear advantage. Each option was weighed and catalogued, but one central principle guided every decision. She would not allow them to leave unchallenged. Not without consequence, not without acknowledgement of the boundaries they had violated. The in-laws attempted to regain composure, their voices trembling between false bravado and fear. They shifted nervously, stepping away from the shadows, their eyes darting toward possible exits. But the rancher anticipated every move. She positioned herself strategically, her body a barricade and a threat simultaneously. Every flicker of shadow, every shift of weight, told her exactly what they intended, and she was ready for it. This moment marked a turning point. The rancher realized that survival alone was no longer sufficient. Action was required. She would no longer react to their aggression. She would dictate it. Her decision to fight back was not impulsive. It was deliberate, informed by years of experience in isolation, by the countless times she had faced threats both human and natural, and emerged unbroken. She had endured storms, broken fences, and injuries that could have ended a lesser person. This was merely another challenge, another test of her strength, resolve, and ingenuity. Her actions began with words first, sharp and precise. "You thought this would break me," she said, her gaze fixed unwaveringly on them. "You were wrong. Every step you take from here on is because I allow it." The in-laws' faces paled, their earlier arrogance evaporating under the weight of her presence. The realization that the balance of power had shifted hit them fully, and they instinctively recoiled. Next came movement. With swift, practiced motions, she began to implement her plan. Rope in hand, she restrained one in-law first, securing them against the barn wall. Each knot was tight, precise, and functional, leaving no room for escape. The other, seeing their companion bound, hesitated, just long enough for her to assert similar control. The barn, once a neutral space where they had thought themselves dominant, was now entirely under her command. Every gesture, every motion, reinforced the message. She was no longer the victim, she was the orchestrator of the outcome. As the last knot was secured, she stepped back, surveying her work and the stunned expressions of her in-laws. The fire of defiance within her burned brighter than ever. The turning point had arrived. She had transformed the humiliation, the violation, and the fear into leverage, clarity, and strength. From this moment onward, she was not merely defending herself, she was asserting justice, autonomy, and control over her own life and land. The first time that night, she allowed herself a fleeting sense of triumph. The spark of defiance had ignited, and it now blazed into an unwavering determination. Whatever came next, she was ready. She had made her decision. She would not simply endure, she would act decisively and on her own terms. The barn's interior felt charged, electric with tension, as if the air itself had thickened around them. Shadows leapt across the walls with the flickering lantern light, exaggerating every movement, every gesture. The rancher's posture was calm but commanding. Shoulders squared, eyes sharp, body coiled with readiness. The in-laws, restrained yet defiant, shifted uneasily, their earlier bravado now fractured into panic and frustration. The balance of power had shifted, but the confrontation had only just begun. She stepped forward, her boots pressing into the straw-strewn floor with deliberate sound. Each movement was precise, purposeful, and calculated to assert dominance. The in-laws tried to regain some semblance of control, hurling taunts and threats, but their words were hollow, unsteady. They underestimated her strength, her endurance, and her ability to think several steps ahead. She met their attempts with unflinching composure, letting their fear and uncertainty become a weapon in her own psychological arsenal. "You've had your fun," she said, voice low, measured, yet carrying an authority that brooked no challenge. "Now it's my turn." The words hit harder than any physical strike, carrying the weight of every insult, every violation, every moment they had assumed they held power over her. The in-laws faltered under her gaze, the threat of retaliation now fully crystallized in their minds. The rancher moved through the space like a predator surveying its territory, positioning herself strategically between them and any potential escape route. She had already anticipated their reactions, studied their patterns, and now she was dictating the rhythm of the encounter. Every step they took was carefully mirrored, every gesture countered. The barn, once neutral ground, had become her stage, and she, the undisputed actor of control. Her hands worked swiftly and methodically, reinforcing restraints, using the rope to limit their movements further. Each knot, each shift of weight, was an assertion of authority. They struggled, hissing threats and insults, but she remained calm, letting their panic feed the tension while keeping her own focus razor-sharp. She knew that fear could be as effective as force when wielded with precision, and she used it to full effect. The confrontation was not merely physical, it was a battle of wills. Every glance, every measured movement, every word exchanged carried weight. She tested their limits, watched for cracks in their composure, and exploited them. Their earlier confidence, their assumption that they could intimidate her, dissolved under the steady intensity of her presence. For the first time, they truly understood that they were no longer in control. "You're going to listen now," she said, her voice cold and unwavering. "Every word, every action comes through me. Understand?" The clarity of her command left no room for negotiation, no opportunity for resistance. They nodded, reluctantly, fear mingling with disbelief. The rancher had turned the tables completely. The aggressors had become the restrained, the dominant, and she alone dictated the outcome. Even in the heightened tension, her mind remained analytical. She considered the next moves carefully, how to maintain control, how to prevent any chance of escape, and how to ensure the in-laws fully grasped the consequences of their actions. Every detail mattered. The placement of her body, the tightening of ropes, the subtle shifts in lighting that accentuated her authority. The confrontation was not a chaotic brawl. It was a controlled assertion of dominance, an unyielding reclaiming of power. As the in-laws ceased their struggles, the barn quieted except for the occasional scrape of rope or creak of timber. The rancher stepped back, surveying her work and the stunned expressions before her. The confrontation had reached a crucial point. She had not only defended herself, but imposed her own order, exacting recognition of the boundaries they had crossed. The fire of defiance that had ignited earlier now roared brightly, fueling her determination for the next stage, deciding the fate of those who had dared to violate her. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of triumph. The confrontation was over, but the consequences were just beginning. Every calculated action had reinforced her autonomy and reminded them, and herself, that she was not a victim. She was a force shaped by isolation, resilience, and a lifetime of survival against the odds, and she would ensure that force was respected by any means necessary. The night air outside the barn was crisp, carrying the faint scent of earth and distant rain. The rancher stepped into it with a controlled determination, dragging the in-laws behind her. Their earlier arrogance had crumbled, replaced by a tense, fearful compliance. They understood now that the night had shifted irreversibly. They were no longer in command, and escape was no longer an option. Her bare feet pressed against the rough terrain as she led them toward a part of the property where she held absolute advantage. Every step was deliberate, every movement a reminder that she dictated the pace and direction of the encounter. She had planned for potential resistance. The barn had been a testing ground, the rope and the environment tools for control. But outside, the land itself became a weapon. She knew every incline, every dip, every hidden patch of loose soil that could unbalance her captives. The in-laws stumbled, their earlier bravado dissolved into cautious compliance. They glanced at her with fear, their eyes wide with realization. Each step reinforced the reversal of roles. The rancher, once humiliated, now fully in command. Their struggles were weak and sporadic, easily anticipated, as if their minds had already accepted the futility of resistance. "You thought you could dominate me," she said, voice steady and sharp. "You were wrong. Every step you take from here is because I allow it." The words were not threats, they were declarations of authority. The in-laws flinched at their weight, a stark acknowledgement of their new position. The terrain became a silent partner in her control. She guided them across uneven ground, past hidden ruts and small gullies, forcing careful steps that slowed their progress and reinforced their vulnerability. Every misstep, every hesitant movement reminded them of the consequences of underestimating her. The rancher's physical advantage, combined with intimate knowledge of the land, ensured that escape was not merely difficult, it was impossible. As they approached a secluded part of the ranch, she paused briefly to survey the surrounding area. The in-laws, sensing her pause, froze instinctively. Even the night sounds, the rustling grass, the distant calls of nocturnal wildlife, felt muted under the weight of tension. The rancher's gaze swept over the land, calculating, strategizing, asserting dominance not just physically, but psychologically. They were her captives, yes, but more importantly, they were witnesses to the power she had reclaimed. She tightened, the ropes just enough to remind them of their restrained state. Every knot, every shift of weight, reinforced the message. Their options were gone. She could sense their anxiety rising, the panic that had begun to simmer in the barn now spreading through their limbs. Yet she maintained a calm exterior, a controlled presence that accentuated their fear and underscored her authority. "You will stay here until I decide otherwise," she said, gesturing toward a small clearing where the ground was firm and flat. "Any attempt to run, any attempt to fight back, and you'll see exactly how serious I am." The in-laws nodded, too aware of their own vulnerability to do otherwise. The rancher's control was complete, both physical and psychological, and they had no illusions about the consequences of defiance. The night stretched on as she guided them carefully, ensuring no opportunity for escape. Every motion, every command, reinforced the message that she was the architect of this moment. Their earlier attempts to dominate her had failed, and she had transformed violation into authority. The reversal of power was total. The predators were now fully under her control, and the land itself, harsh, unyielding, and familiar, was an ally in her enforcement of order. By the time they reached the clearing, the in-laws were compliant, subdued, and fearful. Their initial arrogance had been replaced with a reluctant recognition of her capability, her resolve, and her strategic mind. The rancher, observing the results of her careful planning and execution, felt a surge of quiet triumph. She had not merely survived the night. She had turned it to her advantage, reclaiming both autonomy and dignity. Every step, every calculated movement, had reinforced a truth they would not forget. She was unyielding, unbreakable, and entirely in command. The escape they had imagined was impossible. The capture she had orchestrated was complete. And in that moment, the rancher understood fully that the night's confrontation had shifted more than power. It had shifted the narrative entirely. The moon hung high over the plains, pale and cold, casting a silvery light that stretched long shadows across the undulating terrain. The rancher led her in-laws away from the barn, her grip firm on the rope that kept them close. Their earlier defiance had evaporated entirely, replaced by a tense, fearful compliance. Every footfall was deliberate, each step carefully chosen, to maintain control over the precarious situation. The journey was not merely physical, it was psychological. The rancher knew that the land itself could amplify their fear. The open plains seemed endless, every shadow potentially hiding danger, every rustle of grass or call of a distant animal magnified by their anxiety. She used this knowledge to her advantage, guiding them over uneven ground, across hidden gullies, and past clusters of thorny brush. Each misstep, each moment of uncertainty, reinforced their vulnerability and her authority. Her own movements were precise and unhurried. She could have moved faster, leaving them struggling behind, but she deliberately maintained a pace that allowed them to sense both their dependence on her and the futility of resistance. Her calm, measured presence contrasted sharply with their tense, faltering steps, magnifying the psychological weight of the journey. "You will follow my lead," she said, her voice carrying across the night. "Every step, every movement goes as I dictate." The in-laws nodded, too aware of their precarious situation to speak. Their fear was palpable, radiating in waves, feeding her resolve. This was no longer about punishment alone. It was about teaching, about establishing the unshakable fact that she would not be challenged without consequence. The path she chose led them past familiar landmarks, each imbued with her knowledge of the land. A shallow creek with slippery rocks tested their balance. A steep rise demanded careful footing. Every obstacle reminded them of her mastery and their own fragility. She glanced at them occasionally, noting the tension in their shoulders, the faltering of their gaze, the tiny slips of confidence that betrayed their unease. Each observation informed her next movement, ensuring the journey remained firmly under her control. At one point, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain from distant hills. The in-laws instinctively huddled together, seeking comfort in proximity. But she did not allow them relief. Her presence alone was the measure of authority. She guided them with gentle pressure and firm direction, never cruelty for cruelty's sake, but always ensuring that the lesson, the recognition of her command, was unmistakable. The moonlight revealed subtle changes in the terrain, which she exploited to maintain advantage. Loose soil made footing uncertain, patches of tall grass obscured their steps, and the occasional hollow created natural obstacles. Every movement became a demonstration of her control, a reminder that the environment, which she had mastered over years of labor and solitude, was now an ally in enforcing her dominance. As the journey continued, the in-laws' attempts at conversation grew hesitant, their voices shaky and uncertain. They tried to negotiate, to plead, to find some loophole or weakness, but the rancher ignored their words, letting the silence of the night and the weight of the land itself underscore her authority. Their panic and respect grew in tandem with every careful step they took behind her. Eventually, she guided them toward a small plateau overlooking the sprawling ranch. From this vantage, the land stretched endlessly, hills rising and falling, like waves frozen in time. The in-laws, breathing heavily, glanced around, suddenly aware of how isolated they truly were. No towns, no neighbors, no escape routes, only the rancher and the wild, rugged landscape she commanded. It was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. a testament to her mastery and their utter vulnerability. For a moment, she allowed herself to absorb the scene, feeling the strength of the land and the clarity of her purpose. The journey had been arduous, physically and emotionally, but it had achieved its aim. She had fully asserted control, turning fear and violation into a demonstration of her unassailable authority. The in-laws were no longer a threat. They were a reflection of their own misjudgment, a reminder that she would not be underestimated. In the moonlit silence, the rancher took a deep breath. The journey was far from over, but the night had already proven one immutable truth. She had survived, she had reclaimed power, and she had demonstrated, with every step and every measured action, that no one could challenge her dominion, neither human nor nature itself. The plateau overlooked the entirety of the ranch, a sprawling canvas of rolling hills, scattered cattle, and the winding creek that marked the boundaries of her domain. The moonlight painted the land in silver and shadow, a quiet witness to the night's events. The in-laws stood restrained, tense and utterly aware of their vulnerability, their earlier arrogance replaced with fear and reluctant acknowledgement of her authority. Now, the rancher faced the most critical decision of the evening: how to resolve the situation and what justice or vengeance would be served. Her mind raced through possibilities, weighing morality, practicality, and the lessons she wanted to impart. She could simply leave them restrained, letting the experience itself be punishment enough. That would be just, measured, and assertive without cruelty. Or she could escalate further, using their violation as a reason to exact more tangible revenge, demonstrating that her autonomy was not to be trifled with under any circumstances. Every option carried weight, not only for them, but for herself. How she acted now would define her integrity and the rules of her own life moving forward. The in-laws tried to speak, their voices trembling, filled with protest and excuses. Their words were hollow in the moonlight, unable to undo the humiliation and the shift in power they had initiated. She listened for a moment, letting their pleas and rationalizations wash over her without response. She didn't need their explanations. They were irrelevant. What mattered was action, clarity, and consequence. Finally, she spoke. "You've had your chance to dominate, to humiliate, to belittle," she said, her voice firm and measured, carrying over the quiet of the plains. "That time is over. From here on, you follow my rules, or you face the consequences of your choices. Make no mistake, I decide what happens next." The weight of her authority settled over them like a tangible force. Their compliance was immediate, reluctant, but undeniable. She made her decision. The in-laws would be released, but only after experiencing the full gravity of the night and understanding the boundaries they had crossed. She would not seek unnecessary cruelty, but she would ensure they never underestimated her again. The rope was loosened, but they remained under her watchful eye. She guided them back toward the barn carefully, forcing them to acknowledge her authority in every step, in every gesture, in every word exchanged. On the way, she made sure to demonstrate both restraint and clarity. Every instruction was precise, every command deliberate. The journey back was not about punishment for its own sake, but about reinforcement of the lessons they had failed to learn before arriving. Fear, respect, and recognition of her autonomy were the instruments she wielded. By the time they reached the barn, they were subdued, compliant, and fully aware of their misjudgment. Standing before the barn door, she paused. The ranch stretched behind her, vast and silent, a testament to the life she had built with her own hands. She considered her options one last time: leave them tied, release them completely, or involve outside authorities. Justice, in her mind, was not abstract. It was personal, tied to respect, boundaries, and accountability. She had no desire for cruelty beyond what was necessary, but she would not allow them to leave unchanged. "You will leave this place," she said, her voice steady, and you will never underestimate me again. Remember this night, every moment of it, and the consequences of your actions." The in-laws nodded, the weight of her words sinking fully into their consciousness. There was no argument, no counter. They understood completely that her authority was absolute and her autonomy non-negotiable. As they departed, she watched them disappear into the darkness, their movements cautious, hesitant, and respectful. The silence of the ranch returned, punctuated only by the distant rustle of grass and the occasional low call of cattle. The night had tested her, humiliated her, and forced her into confrontation, but it had also reaffirmed her strength, resilience, and the clarity of her boundaries. The resolution was neither sweet nor bitter. It was decisive, deliberate, and just. The in-laws had faced the consequences of their violation, and she had reclaimed her autonomy, her dignity, and her control. The night's ordeal had transformed fear and humiliation into empowerment, turning what could have been defeat into triumph. She stood alone on the plateau once more, gazing at the silvered landscape. The stars above seemed indifferent, but their light illuminated the truth she now carried clearly and unshakably. She had endured, she had acted, and she had emerged not only unbroken but fully in command of her life and her land. Justice had been done, and in the quiet aftermath, the rancher felt the profound satisfaction of one who had faced adversity and mastered it entirely. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the plains in soft hues of rose and gold. The rancher stood at the edge of the property, her silhouette strong and unwavering against the vast expanse of her land. The night's ordeal had left traces, tension still hummed in her muscles and the memory of violation lingered, but it had also forged a renewed sense of clarity and strength. She was no longer just surviving. She had reclaimed something far deeper: her autonomy, her dignity, and her authority over her own life. She moved through the ranch with deliberate care, performing familiar tasks that once felt mundane, but now carried profound symbolism. Feeding the cattle, checking fences, and inspecting the barns, all acts she had done countless times, felt different today. They were affirmations of her control, reminders that she was the guardian of this land, the architect of every choice she made. Every movement was an assertion. She had endured, she had defended, and she had emerged fully in command. The wind carried the scent of earth and dew, filling her lungs with a sensation of renewal. She allowed herself a moment to pause, to breathe deeply, and to appreciate the silence of the land. A silence earned, not imposed. It was a quiet victory, one that the in-laws' presence had temporarily disrupted, but ultimately could not diminish. She had turned fear and humiliation into strength, and the consequences had been unequivocal. As she dressed in clothes that felt both protective and symbolic of her regained power, she considered the journey of the past night. Every challenge, every moment of fear, every act of defiance had culminated in this reclamation of self. The in-laws had tested her boundaries, but their test had revealed, instead of weakness, the depth of her resilience. Her clothing, now carefully chosen and secure, was more than practical. It was armor for her identity, a visible manifestation of her autonomy restored. She walked to the edge of the pasture and gazed across the sprawling land. The sun now touched the tips of distant hills. The cattle moved slowly in the morning light, and the gentle rustle of grass whispered of continuity, resilience, and life. This land, like her own body and spirit, had survived storms, intrusions, and challenges that sought to unbalance it. And like the rancher, it had endured and remained whole. In that moment, she recognized the profound truth of her experience. Power is not merely the ability to defend oneself in the moment of crisis. It is the steady assertion of boundaries, the refusal to be diminished, and the conscious reclaiming of dignity after it is threatened. The night had been harsh, but it had revealed her capacity for control, clarity, and moral authority. She had acted decisively, not out of vengeance alone, but out of necessity and principle. The rancher felt a deep sense of equilibrium settle over her. The land, the animals, and the tools of her labor were extensions of herself, tangible reminders that her life was hers to govern. She understood that autonomy was both fragile and fiercely resilient, and that true strength lay in recognizing when to act, when to endure, and when to assert control. The ordeal had tested every facet of her being, and she had passed. With a final glance toward the horizon, she took a steadying breath and began her morning chores in earnest. The night's events would remain in her memory, not as scars of weakness but as markers of triumph, proof of resilience, and a reaffirmation of the person she had always been. Every step she took across the property was a reclaiming of her space, her authority, and her life. By the time the sun rose fully over the plains, the rancher was already moving through her land with purposeful energy. The ordeal of the previous night was behind her, the in-laws' threat neutralized, and her own sense of agency restored. She was alone, unyielding, and fully in command, a lone rancher whose strength, autonomy, and courage had been tested and proven beyond question. The plains stretched endlessly before her, wild and untamed, yet entirely hers. And in that vast, open space, the rancher finally felt what she had fought for all along, not merely survival, but complete reclamation of her power, her dignity, and her life.